All right, it is 5:30, so I'll call the meeting to order. There's only one item on the agenda, and that's discussion of our swamp. I'm going to hand this over right away to Allison. Do you want to start and then hand it over to Dick Newhall? So Dick Newhall will be sitting in, if you will, for Bill Alms this evening, and he's another regarding wetlands. So with that, welcome, Dick, and Allison, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Jake...
Allison, I'm sorry. Allison, I'm sorry. I have to do a roll call real quick.
Okay.
For the minute. So sorry about that. So I'm Lisa Whalen. I'm the mayor. I'll call your name and just say here. Shannon Bruce.
Here.
Mike Molitor.
Here.
Pam Martinson.
I think you said me. I'm here.
Okay. John Chumperland.
You were a little choppy.
Here.
Okay. Then we have staff members, Chris Lindquist. Is Chris here?
Unmute Chris.
Okay, I'll come back to Chris. Then we have Ali Polfus.
I'm here.
All right, Mike Baroni.
I am here.
Gary Peters.
I am here.
Brian Grimm.
I'm here.
And David Abel.
I am here.
And I'll get back, and Chris Lindquist. For some reason or other, we're not hearing Chris. Allison, is she on?
Can you hear me?
Oh, no.
Oh,
now we can.
Hello.
Okay. Now
You can hear me now?
All right.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
So,
With
Allison?
that, now that completes our roll call, and we'll move it on now to Allison.
Allison, you want to give a quick explanation as to why Dick is sitting in for Bill Alms?
Sure, and my apologies, my microphone might be cutting in. So tonight we have Jake Newhall. Jake is with our Water Resources Division, and he's filling in for Bill. Bill had to, he was called for a temporary military service, so that's why we have Jake sitting in for us tonight to go through the swamp. So my apologies to the council, but it was an emergency order that took Bill away from us this evening.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. You are breaking up a little bit, so we'll have
Okay,
to
I'll
kind of
switch
keep
over to
tabs.
my phone here.
Okay.
Do you want me to take it over, Allison?
Yeah, please, Jake, if you could get going, and then I'll switch to my phone so that if I need to clarify, I'll be a little clearer.
Okay, thanks for having me this evening. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I believe I met most of you. There was another time when Bill couldn't make it. I think it was about a year ago. So if you recall back then, I am that person. I'm Jake Newhall. So nice to talk to you guys again about this. I want you to flip in your council packet, if you have that in front of you, to page 16 in the PDF. It's a bright orange colored slide. And I'm just going to start from there, just giving an update on kind of where we are at now since we went back through and made some updates per the request that you guys gave to Bill and Allison. So this will be a relatively quick update here, as I know there's more discussion to be had on what the next steps are and how best to handle those. But I just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page and remembers kind of how we got to where we are. So the next page is an overview. And just a reminder, the Stormwater Asset Management Program is a web application. And the purpose of the city undertaking this application was to meet regulatory requirements through the PCA. And then also to not only just meet those, but to help guide them in making decisions as it came to inspection priority and maintenance activities to ensure BMPs keep functioning as they were designed. So we often compare this program to a pavement management program that people may be more familiar with, where a new road would equal a score of 100. In the SWAMP program, a new pond or a pond that meets NERP design guidelines or the city's design guideline, there's some overrides that can be entered in, would start at a score of 100 and then it would degrade over time. And what we say is once it gets to around a 75, we'd like to confirm that it's still functioning as designed. And once you've verified that that score is in fact less than a 50 or below, that would trigger the need to plan for and then complete maintenance. So after these updates, the program summary is there's 105 basins total in the city that are in this program. And currently there are 10 of which that are city owned and the rest are HOA or privately owned and maintained. And then you can see the score breakdown. There's 25 of them that are less than 75, 11 of which are less than a 50. So what we've done there, and this is pretty important, is instead of the city focusing on all 105, we've tried to make that more stomachable, if you will. And now it's 25 that we really say, this is kind of what you want to focus your attention on, as the other ones generally are functioning as designed and don't need as much attention. So the question has come up. Did someone have a question?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Or I can ask. Does anybody have a question? All right, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I thought I heard something. Why aren't all water bodies swamp basins? That question has come up in the past. Why is this wetland maybe not included in the application? And there are numerous wetlands in the city that are included in swamp, but aren't included in the number of basins. And so I just want to make sure that's not confusing. We really want to focus on basins that are currently treating stormwater, and wetlands can be used for that, but that would generally be where they're piped or there are very defined channels that are discharging water from developed areas into a basin. Then that is a wetland, yes, but it's still something that you would maintain as more of a stormwater wetland, and over time you would still need to manage sediment in those. Where they wouldn't be included in the swamp calculations is if they don't have any pipes or defined channels, then we generally leave them out as they don't need to be maintained as treating stormwater. What does it mean if a basin is undersized? The program has been set up to compare basins and to prioritize them to give the next level of attention, whether it's an inspection or a survey, or if it then becomes maintenance because it has been confirmed that it in fact needs to be maintained. And so if a basin is undersized, what that typically means is it may not have been constructed to the full NERP volume. NERP is an acronym for National Urban Runoff Program, and it's just a sizing standard to size a stormwater pond for its tributary area. And so if it has a NERP ratio of less than 1, it may be undersized, or would be an indicator that it's undersized. And what that really means is generally smaller ponds or ponds that are undersized will just fill in faster. It doesn't really mean that it's bad or anything like that. It just means that you may need to complete maintenance more frequently. So the next page is, what does it mean if it's undersized? That's continued. I think I kind of just touched on that. So basically they will fill in faster. 4-bays, the question has come up as 4-bays are a very common thing in the city of Minnetrista. How would that be managed? Well, a 4-bay is put in just similar to a sump or a pre-treatment basin, and there's many different types of pre-treatment. So the larger a forebay is, the less frequently, I should say, it would need to be maintained. So in some areas, the standard is to actually install pre-treatment that is consistent with NERP treatment. And depending on who you ask, some people will say that's overkill or over-designed. However, what it does end up being then is if it is NERP treatment, then you have a longer period of time prior to the degradation of that forebay. And these forebays are put in to protect the filtration or infiltration BMPs. So if the forebay is a little bit more undersized, that is again okay. It is just kind of treated like a smaller pond where it would need to be cleaned out more frequently. And my best example of that is a sump would be about the smallest pre-treatment you could have. And sumps generally need to be cleaned out every year or twice a year, depending on their tributary area. So, could forebays be retrofit in the future to reduce the frequency of maintenance? Yes, if there is the possibility for expansion or digging them a little bit deeper, that would just be additional volume that would allow you more time before you would have to go maintain that forebay. And again, your same rule of thumb, once that forebay is about 50% full, you would run more of a risk of pushing sediment or other debris into your downstream BMP.
This is Pam. Are the forebays included in your 105 total count?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Yep, the calculation in SWAMP had to be updated to accurately reflect that. So, and Allison can correct me if I'm wrong here, but so that forebay is actually then what we're looking at to ensure that that forebay provides the necessary treatment prior to the water discharging to the next level of treatment, so that because the forebays are generally a lot cheaper to maintain than it would be to redo a whole filtration basin or that full-on maintenance. And so that is a summary. Does anyone have any questions they would like to talk about on just kind of the refresher of SWAMP and the update and kind of how we got to where we are?
This is Shannon Bruce. I have a question, and it's regarding the Mpca requirements. Can you sort of help us understand what those Mpca requirements are? Do they give us guidance on, you mentioned ponds being rated at 50% or less, or 75% or 75 or less that require maintenance? And also, what repercussions are there to the city if we don't adequately deal with the Mpca requirements?
Sure, that's a good question. So first off, the Mpca requires that an MS4, such as Minnetrista, would have a standard operating procedure for prioritizing inspections and surveys. So what that means is they have a responsibility to prioritize how often they would go out and inspect and survey their basins. Now, there's 2 layers of the MS4 permit, and this is where it does tend to get a little confusing, so I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I will get into the weeds as much as I need to make sure you guys understand. But there's one part that is just focusing on the storm sewer inlets and outlets and outfalls and those pieces of the storm sewer system. And with that is a visual inspection of all BMPs throughout the city. It's required that those happen for every BMP once every 5 years. And so no matter what, you would have to go out and inspect the inlets and outlets or outfalls from your storm sewer system. And then when I say visual inspection, it is just as simple as that. Take some pictures of the pond, see if there's sediment sticking above the water level, what we like to call, or some of our clients kind of make fun of it, are there ducks walking on water where there's shallow spots that need to be maintained? Those are visual inspections. And so the PCA does require you to go do that once every 5 years. Where it doesn't require a frequency currently is in terms of going out and actually surveying the basin. It requires a community to have a standard operating procedure for prioritizing that. But it doesn't say you have to go out there every year or every 5 years or even every 10 years. It says, we trust you to come up with a standard operating procedure for how frequently you would go out and determine that these things are still functioning. And the same goes for then maintenance. You don't have to maintain your ponds or your large BMPs on a certain interval. It's more, once you've determined they aren't functioning as they were designed, then it's on the city to ensure that they maintain those and they're back functioning. Does that answer that question?
Yes. So it's up to the city to come up with the SOPs and to determine what our process is, and that's really it, right?
Correct. And so when the city signed up for SWAMP, one of the things that they were interested in getting was meeting that inspection and maintenance SOP. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do exactly what SWAMP tells you by any means. There's a lot of flexibility in the program. But it was then, I believe, the understanding that the city would be using, or the intent would be to use SWAMP as the SOP to help it meet that requirement. So then you ask the question of where do the numbers 75 and where do the numbers 50 come in? I would say when I say the number 50, as in once it reaches a SWAMP score of 50 or it's half full, that's an industry standard. Is pretty much once your BMP is half full, it's time to maintain it. You're losing the benefit or the majority of the benefit that it provided and why it was installed in the first place. So that's where that 50 comes in. The 75 is really a starting point, and I would say, just for your guys' information, I believe WSB has 23 clients on SWAMP, and I would say the majority of them, that inspection or survey trigger is between 65 and 75. So depending on how large the city is, we do have some very large communities on it. And if they took it all the way to 75, the number just gets extremely, it has to do with their resources and what it makes sense to go out and inspect at the time and how many they have. So that's where we're at right now, is we've suggested 75 as a starting point, but absolutely if the city council wanted to change that starting point for triggering inspections and surveys, that could be easily changed to a 70 or a 65. So.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Yes. Are there any other questions on that?
I don't think so. Go ahead, Jake.
Okay. So then if you go to the beginning of your packet, there is an updated memo here that you'll see from Bill Alms. And this memo goes through that that assumption that the basins that are scoring less than 75, we would recommend performing bathymetric inspections on those. And I know in the past this has been a discussion point at the city of how is it best to go do those, because those basins in this case are privately or HOA owned and maintained. And so how is it best to coordinate that requirement or the need to have those basins surveyed? And so what I think we're going to talk about today, and Allison can jump in, is our recommendation here, and kind of discuss that through and see what the next steps are.
Okay, council, any questions? All right, go ahead, Jake or Allison.
Allison, do you want to just kind of give an intro of what we feel like the next steps are here, or do you want me to go through that?
No, I can jump in here. Thanks, Jake. So
Okay.
the last time we talked to the council about this at the work session, we went back to identify what are 4 bays because we were seeing some relatively new ponds with a low score. So Jake explained, what happened in that instance. We're now putting in the note that where there are 4 bay or that pre-treatment feature. So the next step is implementation of this, and to what Jake had said, what protocols does the city council want to start looking at as far as implementing the swamp plan and compliance with the MS4 permitting. So previously we had talked about taking 2 ponds, 2 different property owners, working with them to see, to explain what the program is, why we do it, and so on, because the majority of the ponds within Minnetrista are privately owned. We can certainly keep going down that route. Another option would be to take a look at, for example, in the Woodland Cove section, I'm looking at page 3 of the work session packet, and we start seeing some of those 4 bays built in 2013 that the program is saying, looking at how much water is draining to that area, the swamp score is very low, it's 0. Is it an opportunity to go and take a look at a relatively large homeowners association that likely has a professional property management company that works with them that should be familiar if it's a large enough property management firm and is representative of a lot of communities throughout the metro that should be familiar with these requirements. We can certainly look at going in that direction, but the idea here is now looking at the number of ponds that are within that range to go and take that further look. How would council like to approach implementation of this plan?
So Allison,
Okay.
John, a quick question. On the page you were referencing, the number 3, Woodland Cove, you've got 11 4 bays there that are all under 75. So those are 11 of the 25 that Jake originally noted that are already 50 or down to 50?
Correct. And
Okay.
so we took a look at that, breaking it down to what our current swamp score is, and then also did a projection out to 2030 so that the council can see, what ponds are in 10 years would we anticipate coming into that. And the reason we did it that way is if you take Woodland Cove, for example, with it being a very large development, if we were to work with those folks first and look at those, to your point, Councilmember Chumperland, the number of ponds within the swamp plan that are within that threshold to take another look, they may want to take this opportunity to look at some of those ponds that might be scoring less than 75 within the next 10 years, so they can go and establish is the loading, is the volume of material in that 4 bay consistent with what the swamp plan is estimating. So they might want to take that opportunity, so it helps them to do a little bit of planning on their part too.
Thank you.
Council, any other questions?
This is Pam. In the Woodland Cove area, there are a lot of them that scored very low are all like in the 2013 year construction. I think we talked about this the first time. Isn't that flagging that there may have been some type of an error in the design?
Madam Mayor, if I can answer that question. That's a great question, because that's why when we first looked at this, we didn't have that last column on the right side, the justification. So when you look at it, it would appear that it wasn't designed properly. But when we start looking at the number and the design of those ponds, we're finding that they're a 4-bay, which, as Jake had mentioned, those 4 bays are those kind of the first line of defense, so to speak, to take out the most of the nutrients. So it's different from a traditional stormwater pond where you have, let's say, a 1 acre pond that takes all the stormwater. These 4 bays are smaller and so they'll require more frequent maintenance because they'll be discharging to other surface water management features, like, for example, an infiltration basin or something to that effect, that are quite expensive. And so you want to reduce the amount of maintenance on that expensive feature and have a 4-bay right where the pipe discharges that would require more frequent maintenance. So it's not an under design. It's not a poorly designed or improperly designed. It's just it's an indication of it. It's an indication of that that particular mechanism would require maintenance right now based on its size. An example. Oh, go ahead.
Allison. So Allison, for instance, so these were installed in 2013, 7 years ago. Is it fair to say that a lot of, maybe not all, but a lot of 4 bays need to be cleaned out, maintained every 5 to 6 years? I mean, is that, because when you go down and you see other ones also built in that same time frame, they're a little bit higher scoring. So I guess the question would be, why are these so low and then others in the same time frame are higher? It has to do with construction or what?
Just looking at the swamp score numbers, it's I would liken it to, you know, if you look at when you walk in your front door, if there's 2 adults that are pretty clean and you know, have clean shoes, you have a very small doormat. But if you have you know, a number of kids or, you know, people that have to walk through the mud, you'll have a nice big doormat to take that mud off your boots. That's what I think of when I see this. Some of these 4 bays in the basins that are scoring smaller are likely smaller than these others. The other component is, and Jake can jump in here if I'm misspeaking, but it's also the area that drains to these 4 bays. So you may also have a very large drainage area going to some of these 4 bays that are scoring low, and the ones that are scoring higher, you know, simply don't have that area draining to it to bring in those the sediment into those 4 bays.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and add. Just add to that is, if the developer or the developer's engineer, when they did these, all designed each 4 bay the exact same based on the tributary area, then you're right. That would it would be an indicator that they should be filling in generally at the same time. However, and I obviously did not review those plans at the time, but I'm guessing the developer engineered them slightly different. And so in some cases, there was more space available and the 4 bays were a little bit bigger. And in some cases, he cut down and made them, or he or she cut that down and they made them as small and tight as they could be. So what you're seeing here is the ones that are more on the edge of undersized, not necessarily undersized because they had to get approved at some point, but those would then fill in more frequently.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have questions?
Yes, this is Shannon Bruce. You mentioned working with homeowners associations and identifying costs for surveying their ponds. Do we have like a ballpark estimated cost per, you know, how big the pond is, how much it is going to cost to survey it and inspect it and get an estimate on how much it's going to cost to maintain it? I think at the end of the day, those HOAs, that's the information they want, is how much is it going to cost per pond to do what we need to do.
Yeah, we could certainly, Councilmember Bruce, we can provide some, a range of what we've heard for bathymetric surveys to provide to those HOAs so that they can have an understanding on what the cost is. There's certainly that opportunity cost as well, where once you have the people out there to do the work, that there's a nominal additional fee to add additional forebays or other features into that bathymetric survey while they're already out there. But we can assist them in that respect as far as providing a range of cost for that.
And would it be possible to let council know what those costs are before taking those costs to the HOAs?
Yeah, we sure can. Jake, do you have a range of what you typically see for a bathymetric survey for a forebay?
Yeah, typically I would say what we say to do a basin survey, and this is again variable. If it's a 3-acre basin, it tends to be higher. If it was a forebay, I would say it would tend to be lower. And like she said, there is an efficiency of scale. If you go out and do two basins or you do 20, doing 20 would have a little bit lower cost per basin. That being said, we generally say about $500 to do a basin survey. And I think that's we've definitely done hundreds of these at WSB. So for a forebay, if you were to just say you went out and did 10 forebays, I would say it would definitely average less than $500 a basin, because you're probably going out there and taking maybe 4 or 5 shots and getting close to enough information. Whereas if you were going out to, let's say, an acre pond, you might need to go get, say, 25 shots throughout that basin to be sure you had a pretty good representation of what the underwater contours or bathymetry would look like. So I generally say about $500, but there's definitely efficiencies of scale and depending on the size. So does that help?
And I guess to further that question is the efficiencies of scale. You're talking about $500 per basin. What if it was just a private pond and you're just doing one?
Yeah, if it's a private pond and we were just doing one and it was WSB being asked, I think it would be pretty tricky to do it. I don't even know that we could do one for 500, just factoring in obviously MOB from site and just the data processing. It would be a little bit tough, and that's where we could probably survey 6 of those in a day though. Once you're out there, those little forebays, you can blast through quite a few of them. So I think that's where Allison said there are some variables, right? Like if it's a homeowners association that the maintenance is being undertaken by an organization that's used to this stuff, they may have a maintenance staff that could do that when they were on site for a given forebay and have it be much cheaper. If you were just talking about one basin, it would likely be much cheaper for that organization to do it while they're out there than it would be for a WSB to go do one of them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my understanding was also part of the discussion tonight, next steps, and then who is going to pay for the next steps. Because I know at one time we talked about possibly the city covering maybe some of the expense for the bathymetrics and the further analysis. And, I thought that might be part of the discussion here tonight. Because if we don't have that discussion, I'm concerned that staff doesn't have enough direction as to where to go, because that's going to be the first question that the HOAs or people are going to be asking. Well, who's going to be paying for this? Who do we go to have these bathymetrics done, and so on. So I thought if we could answer some of those questions, then it would give a little clearer direction to move on to that next step.
This is John. I have a question. Mr. Abel or whoever, do we have any idea on these HOAs, whether it's Woodland Cove or any of the others, whether their fees were intended to cover anything like this?
David, you want to answer that?
Like their homeowners association fees that they pay, or
Yeah, if in these places where there are multi-ponds, of course I haven't lived in one, but I would assume that would have been a consideration of what they're being charged, is that sooner or later there's cost incurred here.
yeah, it's going to vary. Some are, some, as Allison said, that have professional management companies that run the HOA are going to be sitting in a better position and plan ahead. So it's going to vary. You're going to have one end of the spectrum where yes, they're planning for it and they've got a pot of money ready to go, and some of them probably are not going to have anything. They're not collecting fees for it. So it's going to be, you'll have a wide range of that.
Okay.
This is Councilmember Molitor. I think that brings up a good point, and something that I'm thinking about here is I think before we get into cost, I think we have to start establishing what the objective criteria is that we're going to impose upon, whether it be a HOA or a private homeowner. Are we going to say that the swamp score is less than X, and we need to decide what X is? Then we are going to proceed with next steps. I think we kind of have to have that framework established before we get too far in the weeds on cost. And I what I heard in the presentation here was between 65 and 75. Personally, I would probably go a little bit on the lower end of that, probably in the 65 range. But I think we need to have some policy that we're putting in place here so that people understand that they're not being singled out or unfairly burdened. I don't want to go and have this be, oh, you planned for it, therefore you're going to be held to the standard. Oh, you didn't plan for it, we're going to give you a break. That part, whether they've been accruing for this money or not, I'm not responsible for their homeowners association. They are. But I think what I am responsible for as a council member is to make sure that we've got a policy that is at least somewhat uniform, that we can apply across the board, and so that regardless if people are planned or not, at least we're being consistent and fair across the board. And when I looked at this, like I said, I having worked on the pavement management plan and tending to understand that the scores there are not quite as precise as or not quite as accurate as the precision assumes they are. I'm not comfortable with anything, reaching out to anybody over 65. Like I said, I might even, 65 would be the highest I would go, but I would like to probably have that discussion first before we talk about cost. So my thought is, 65, maybe 60. I'd be interested in hearing what other people have to say on that.
Okay. I'll let Pam, why don't you chime in on that number?
I have a question on, and you might not be able to answer this. How long would it take for a pond to go from 65 to 50? A year, 2 years, 5 years?
It just depends on basically the size of the drainage area and the amount of impervious coverage in that drainage area, as well as how then big is the forebay or the pond that is receiving that. So that's actually, that question is why the program, one of the main reasons why this program was developed, was to try help prioritize basins needing attention, basically basins needing city resources or private resources in some cases to go out and survey and then maintain. Was generally the bigger the drainage area, the smaller the basin. You put those together and you'll see that's how the program will degrade these basins. So that question is a very good question. It's a very loaded question because it's really the reasoning this program was all set up. If every basin degraded at the exact same amount of time, there would be no reason to have this. You would just look at the age of the basin and then maintain them all based on that.
Thank you.
Okay, because my thoughts on that, if we drop it from 75 to 65, whatever, these types of projects, when you connect with like HOAs or private owners, the process typically moves slow. So that's just the nature. I mean, it's not something that everybody's excited to do. So people tend to drag their feet. So I would tend to not go much lower than a 65 or 60 for sure. That's just my opinion, because it will take time to get all of that done once it's determined who should be doing it.
Okay, good points. John?
I could hang my hat on 65. It's 65, looking at the current list here, still gives us 16 that are 65 or under of the 25, and they're in multi jurisdictions, if you want to call it that, multi HOAs, and a couple of private ones. So we're going to get a sampling of multi jurisdictions, again, I use that word, to find out what the pushback or the response is going to be.
We'll call them organizations. How is that?
Okay.
And Shannon?
The 65 number is fine. I would even go as low as 60, but I count at 65, I count at 19, but I mean, we can deal with that later. But I think taking it down to 65 or 60 gives us a manageable number of ponds to deal with. And I guess what my next question, and I may be getting ahead of myself, but is when we're looking at private ponds outside of HOAs, what authority, absent of a taxing district, do we have to make private owners comply with what we're asking them to do?
Madam Mayor, if I may. So that's a great question, and that's what requires a lot of research. If David Abel can jump in here if he's got experience or knowledge with some of these that are privately owned. But when I look at that list of privately owned, to me that says you need to go back to look at when those ponds were constructed. Take a look at the developers agreements, any kind of covenants that were recorded against the property. It requires more investigation into that to find out, are there mechanisms in place that we can require the maintenance of those on private properties. And then I think depending on the outcome of that, I would recommend that we would have a discussion with the city attorney's office to ensure that the next steps taken would be appropriate from the city's legal standpoint as far as notifications and requirements of those private property owners.
Okay.
Mayor and Council, I mean, I'm obviously not the attorney. This is Mike Baroni. But from what I remember, and David or maybe Allison could correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand is if you're talking about private property and it's a pond that's solely owned by a private property owner, I understand where Councilmember Bruce is coming from, and that how do you pretty much make them do it? Well, I think from what I recall, the trigger is that this is the city's MS4 permit that would not be in compliance. So it's short of creating a taxing district ahead of time, which we've done for many years now with new developments, but there are areas where those don't exist. I believe it would be on us to somehow make them do it and make them pay for it, because we would not be having our MS4 permit be in proper compliance. So it's, I don't think hopefully it won't ever come to that. Hopefully homeowners will realize that it's good for the ecosystem, et cetera, but there might be an occasion, and I'm sure maybe either Allison or Jake can give us an example maybe from another area where that's the case, but I believe it's on us because it's our permit to deal with.
Well, and this is Shannon, Councilmember Bruce. That's why I asked the question of the Mpca requirements, and what was explained that all they require are SOPs to prioritize, inspect, and survey. And so I'm missing something here, because there doesn't seem to be any authority for the city to make anyone do anything.
Yeah, this is
I'll let
Jake.
the engineers answer. Yeah.
This is Jake. What I will tell you is this is an evolving target, and
So with the city being an MS4, it comes down to the MS4 permit. So the state has said to the city, your city the best as far as how you want to manage this. Here are the criteria that we are giving the rules, so to speak, for you to operate within, and we leave it to you to implement this plan. And as far as if there's repercussions, if the city has a standard operating procedure, let's say, we notify, for example, we notify HOAs, private property owners, whoever, whatever property owner has a 4-bay, a pond, what have you, with a swamp score of 65 or less. And we notify you that, this is, make the explanation of why it's important, and just leave it at that, and not have any follow through to make sure that, and guidance and all that to make sure that it's done. The question becomes then, are we in compliance with our MS4 permit, and what repercussions does the PCA have against the city in that instance? To my knowledge, that hasn't come up in the metro area. I don't think that the MS4 permitting is old enough that we've seen that. And Jake, if you have any examples that you can draw from, but I think it basically comes down to we're no longer we're no longer consistent and in compliance with our permitting from the state standpoint.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. As an MS4, it is the city's responsibility to ensure that those basins continue to operate as they were designed and approved. Ultimately, what could happen is the PCA could fine the city. Has that happened? They do routine audits, and I believe fines have been given. I don't believe fines have been given for a standard operating procedure for private ponds per se. But what I will say is that this is an evolving topic. And what I was going to say there before Allison jumped in was we are working with some clients that generally our clients initially, they really focus on the city-owned basins because that's 100% in their control. They can budget for those. They generally own the land. They can do all of that work. And then they don't have to deal with the funding mechanism on the back end. What now clients are focusing on is more, how do we do the private ponds? And it's exactly the question you guys are asking. And so some clients that we have worked with are creating a program where they reach out. Let's just say Minnetrista here, they would send a letter. The first step is a letter kind of educating them and informing them of the program. So exactly what you guys are talking about. And then they give them a certain amount of time to respond. So basically asking them to submit documentation or any other evidence that those basins are still operating as approved by a surveyor or an engineer. And then based on that, the city could go and update their program. And once they get that information, the next step would be, and you would put this in the letter, is if it is not operating, the expectation is that would that basin get restored to how it was designed to meet the intent of that BMP. And so that's another thing where then you would give maybe another year, let's say, we expect this work to be done by the end of 2021, right? And the nice thing that you have going for you on these types of things is, as long as there's not properties being damaged or any safety issues, and as far as we know right now, none of that is the case with any of these basins, you do have time on your side that allows those HOAs or private businesses to plan, get their ducks in a row, and then complete that work. And the last phase 3 step of what we're hearing people do is they work with the city attorney and they develop a plan that if for some reason someone is unresponsive to providing that information, the city then would have the authority to go and complete that work and assess. That's obviously the last step and the step that is the least appealing for people. But we know that things are developing differently now than they did necessarily, 30, 40 years ago. So now when development comes in, it's generally there's a developer guideline or a operation and maintenance document that identifies how often that needs to be done. So for stuff that happens now, I would say that's kind of becoming the norm is, well, we won't have to deal with this in 5, 10, 15 years because we have these formal agreements. It's more how to go backwards if there was never that agreement.
So I want to make this as Mayor Whalen, I want to make a couple comments. One, when you keep inferring private ponds meaning owned by HOAs, because I don't believe we have any ponds that are owned by one entity or one individual property owner. So my understanding would be that the costs associated with this would be spread out over a number of different properties. But Jake, you just mentioned one thing that here's the problem that we have, especially with the older developments. When these ponds were put in or forebays were put in, whatever, we don't have specific instructions agreements in terms of when they're needed to be cleaned or even inspected. And a lot of the HOA people, presidents, and you name it, the people that are running these HOAs, they're kind of like, well, what do we do? How do we do this? That's where I thought the city could partner with them and help them figure out what to do, when to do it. That was my thought, is we have, if you will, the expertise to help them. And I think to go in there and just kind of mandate that they have to do this, they're going to go, well, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we do this? Whereas if we can work with them and say, look, here's the resources, and the city's willing to help you, to work with you, that kind of thing. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yep, and I think the first phase that Bill and Allison have outlined in this memo is, I think it is meant to educate and inform, and just kind of talk to them about what the city's process is, and to enter that conversation as a teammate.
Okay.
I agree. This is Shannon Bruce. I agree. We want to enter in as somebody that wants to help them comply with this. And the question, I also had a question about if they do perform the inspection and the maintenance, and then I think we also need to outline what the expectation is for notifying the city about what they did, so that we can maintain the swamp database and make sure that we stay on top of it in the future.
Yeah, we can certainly, Madam Mayor, this is Allison. We can certainly have that conversation too, as far as, notification. For all we know, there might be a proactive homeowners association that's managed, and perhaps they've already been doing some of this work, that if we, that would be a great situation if we could reach out to them and they would say, oh, well, we actually already performed some maintenance. So we can certainly look at, doing a communication as far as protocols and notifications so that the city can keep that information up to date as well.
Absolutely. And I think, getting that information, maybe it has already been completed, or even just proactively requesting it so that once it is completed, the city can update its database and then be ultimately compliant with their MS4 permit.
Well, one of the things I look at too is if we're going to be requiring them to do these bathymetric or inspections, then I think they'd be more willing to have the inspection done if we say we're going to help you. Maybe it's a part of that help is a partial funding. If we're talking, like with some of these HOAs, if we're talking 3 or 4 ponds that need to be inspected, we're talking a couple $1,000. Maybe it's a 50-50. I'm just throwing some thoughts out because I think when there's a carrot there that says, okay, eventually you're going to have to do it, and right now this is what we're offering, I think they're going to be far more readily convinced that they should do this now versus later if there's some type of a financial benefit to it. Comments?
This is John T. I don't know if the initial letter, and I would expect this is more than one letter. I mean, for this program to get going, I think initially there has to be a feeler sent out, if that's the term, of identifying what the letter is addressing, that it is our belief, or however you would word it, that there's ponds that are under your control, according to dimensions or whatever you'd get into, to say it looks like they need maintenance done to them to keep them maintaining to the level that was originally expected, and not to be saying that or inferring that we might help them financially. I guess that's the word, is financially. Certainly give them resources, give them information, connect them to experts that can explain it, possibly, if they have more, because there's going to be questions that come out of that initial letter that you can never address them all in a letter anyway. And then that's kind of the first step of just getting the ball rolling, in my belief. And then down the road, Mr. Malter says we need to have if we're going to have some type of financial support, there needs to be some type of set policy put in place.
This is Shannon Bruce. From talking to some of these HOA members, and I've been talking to them over the last few weeks, is I believe what is going to be most helpful is, one, to give them a list of contractors that they can talk to, tell them what the estimate is, the numbers that we just talked about tonight, $500 per pond, and prioritizing their ponds for them. I think that information, right now they're so overwhelmed with all these ponds and where do they start, and but I think if we do that work for them, we prioritize the ratings of 65 or less and give them a list of contractors, what we think it should cost, then at least they have a place to start. And I believe a lot of them will start and may not need any financial incentives to do so.
Another question, kind of piggybacking on that, is we look at the list here, and we've got the ponds identified by numbers, and of course we've got the maps here that identify them as well. Would a homeowners association, how do we tell them the ponds in question? Do they know? Are these numbers universal? I mean, does everybody know what their numbers are?
Well,
Yes.
I would recommend that we send, along with the letter, that we send an actual map such as what's in our packet and identify the ones and just say, here's the ones that have been identified so they can visually see where they are in their development. Then they can easily find them and know which ones they are.
Yeah, this is Shannon Bruce. I know the HOA in Hunter's Crest, they have our packet and they know what the ponds are and their numbers and all of that.
So what I'm hearing, I'm going to kind of wrap it up here a little bit. What I'm hearing is we're going to pursue or send out some letters, some informational letters on ponds or forebays that are less than 65, and kind of an informational letter with who they can contact, just rough estimates as to what they could expect to pay for these inspections. What else? Anything else?
Is it possible for the city to give them a list of contractors?
Well, that would be a question for Mr. Beatty or Mr. Baroni. Mr. Baroni?
Well, I think you're asking the wrong guy about a list of contractors. I'd be happy to help coordinate that. I believe our engineer would probably be able to give me a list of contractors.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, we can certainly work with to provide that information. We have to be very careful, though, that we're not that it's not received as a recommendation, because we are not allowed to provide recommendations. But we can work to formulate a list of known agencies that or businesses that will do this work. To the best of our knowledge, and clearly indicate that there are likely others it's not an all-inclusive list, and we encourage people to go and find other sources to draw from. I just get very careful when we start listing contractors to people.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that too. This is Mike Baroni. This happens all the time when people have work that comes in the door for a community development area, planning area, and they'll ask if they recommend a surveyor or something like that. And we always say, no, we are not in the recommendation business. We can maybe steer them toward how best they can maybe find those people, but ultimately it's up to the person that's going to actually buy their services to determine who they are. As Allison mentioned, it's a bit of a slippery slope, so we don't look like we're in the recommending business. But I understand what Councilmember Bruce is saying. Is like, I guess if whatever we could do to steer them without recommending would be my goal on that. So
I think because some people, they just simply don't have a clue as to where to go.
Right.
So even if so I think we should give them some list and say, this isn't infinite, this is a, and we're not recommending, we're just giving you a starting point. This
is
what I think
Councilmember Waller.
Yeah.
I'd like to add on that. I think the
Go ahead.
points are really, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay. I think the points are very valid, but I think with any kind of a list, I would not proactively put that out there. If people call into the city and ask, then we can have that. But I think just from the perspective of, proactively putting that out there is a little bit of a slippery slope. And we're dealing with different levels of HOAs here. The first one obviously on the list here is Woodland Cove, and they've got some that are, in the 0 category, but they're also a huge HOA. And I'm certainly hoping that the person that gets the letter isn't going to go, what's this? They better know what's going on. Otherwise we got a big problem. And so I really think versus somebody else that, like a Hermitage Shores, where they may have not been as active and it's older, that might be a little different, but I don't think we can assume they're all going to have the same level of knowledge. And I think the expectation, especially with like Woodland Cove, is that someone's going to get this that has a pretty strong
knowledge of what the requirements are and knows what that needs to get done. So I just want to make sure that we're not just kind of taking a blanket approach. I think we kind of have to, we can send out a standardized letter, but keep it pretty generic. And then if people have questions, we can offer more tools and assistance. And one of those might be some contractors that do this type of business.
Well, let me ask you something. Let me ask Allison, what type of businesses, obviously engineering firms, but could we at least list what type of businesses they could inquire? So for instance, you could say most engineering, I'm just paraphrasing this, most engineering firms do this type of work, most whatever firms do this kind of work, or, you know, so that at least they have a direction that they can go. So we're not recommending, like Mike Molitor was saying, but yet we're giving them some kind of a direction. Is that possible?
Just before we get into that, we're kind of talking about two different things now. What I'm hearing you say, Ms. Whalen, is the engineering, the surveying part. But what I heard Ms. Bruce talk about was the actual excavation. Those are two completely different sets of people. And obviously the engineering comes first, and then the construction, if necessary. Well, let's just not jump to that conclusion. I mean, obviously, if your pond is scoring 0, you're going to be doing some excavating. But they're two different things, right? I mean,
I wasn't talking about. Yeah, you're right. No, I wasn't talking about excavating. I was talking about doing the initial bathymetric study.
Right.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah, the first step.
Ms. Bruce was referring to the actual excavation part, if I understood that correctly.
Actually, this is Shannon. This is Shannon. What I think might be appropriate is to identify search terms to find inspectors and search terms to find contractors, excavation contractors, both in the letter. So if you want to do an inspection, here are some search terms you can find those contractors that are capable of performing those. And the same thing with excavators if you end up having to do maintenance work. So I think that's easy to do. Without having,
I think Madam Mayor.
Yep, Ms. Fauske, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think the council's got some good recommendations here where we can look at providing the recipients of the letter with some criteria that they would be looking for when searching for a survey firm or engineer firm to do this work. And once they make that initial contact with the professional, that professional can help guide them through the process. So I think that's really good direction from the council, because it kind of becomes a natural progression. Once they find the right company to do that fits their needs, that can do the work that's necessary to determine where they're at in their, to verify the swamp score, they should be able to provide some additional guidance to those folks for the next steps should that be necessary.
Right. Okay. All right. So we're just going to give a overall kind of big umbrella kind of information, and anything under 65, those property owners will be notified. Is that kind of wrapping it up?
Just a clarification, there's 3 that are listed at private that are under 60. Are we including them?
Ms. Fauske, we would need the information as to what the address and who the owners are of those ponds.
Correct. Madam Mayor, what I would propose is council's given excellent direction as far as what the next step would be. What I would like to do is have an opportunity to put together this information, similar to where we were last year when we were looking at this, so that the council can see what the tone is on the letter and ensure that that we're hitting the mark as far as the tone of the letter, and understand that those privately owned ponds may require some additional research and might not be ready to go with that first round, and that we could at least get started on some of these known known organizations get the notification out there, knowing that we can continue work on some of those privately owned ones and get the right information.
All right. I think that sounds like a good plan. I think, are we all in agreement
Yes.
heading down that path?
This is Pam. I agree.
Mike?
Yeah, I agree. One caveat though is on those private ones, the 3 that I see here on page 13 of the packet, we do need to get that resolved as to who the owners are fairly quickly, because it goes back to my statement about being consistent across the board. I don't want to, look like I'm picking on HOAs just because we don't know the names and addresses of these 3. We've got to be, we can go ahead with the HOAs, but these 3 can't be too far behind.
Yeah, I believe these
Understood.
might be older developments and they're just listed as private, is my guess. I don't think that they're one entity. You would never do a pond for one house, so we'll look into that, definitely. All right, good point made. So we're at 6:40. We do want to take a little break before we have to sign in for our next meeting. So staff, I think you have direction. This will come back to us when this letter would come back to us for approval.
Madam Mayor, I'll work with Mr. Baroni as far as what the schedule is. If we want to bring this back as a regular discussion item in 2 weeks. 2 weeks might be pushing it, but certainly within the month we would have something to the council.
Okay, that would mean at our meeting, our second meeting in July, since we don't have a first meeting. Okay,
Yes,
well, we'll
correct.
look for that no later than then, if possible sooner, but if not, we'll look for the second meeting in July. All right, with that, is there then a motion to adjourn?
This is Shannon. I'll move that.
All right, is there a second?
This is Pam. I'll second that.
Okay, so a motion has been made. All those in favor signify with aye. Just say yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Shannon?
Yes, I said yes.
Okay, so motion, it's unanimous, so we are adjourned and we will reconvene for our regular city council meeting at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.